In this section, we will be talking about form as it relates to sculpture and its qualities as objects in the real world. We will also be talking about organic and geometric form and how it relates to negative and positive space, as well as the principles of art. Form is usually associated with sculpture because of its three-dimensional nature. Ad Reinhardt and Barnett Newman have been alternately quoted as saying that sculpture is something you bump into when you back up to look at a painting. Whether or not either of them said that, sculptures are something that you can bump into. Sculpture not only has a third dimension, it has mass too, meaning that it is prone to serious incidents as opposed to painting. If they are in your way and you are not careful enough, you can even get hurt. An example of that being the sculpture Bed of Spikes, 1968-69, by Walter de Maria. Bed of Spikes is a dangerous piece of art. It has been displayed with a disclaimer, fenced off, or with a term of responsibility signed by visitors. Richard Serra's Sculpture No. 3 and Reading Cones are a couple of other dangerous works of art. In 1971, a contractor was killed while setting up the former, and in 1988, 2 workers were seriously injured while deinstalling the latter. A few other examples would be Anish Kapoor's Descent into Limbo, 1992, and Doris Salcido's Shibboleth, 2007, as well as Christo and Jean-Claude's Umbrellas, 1991. In 2018, a visitor fell into Anish Kapoor's Descent into Limbo, while Umbrellas crushed a woman to death in California and got a worker electrocuted in Japan. And what about Robert Smithson's Map of Broken Glass, 1969, seen in this picture? Would you step close to it? Does the thought of it gives you goosebumps? Here is Michael Heiser's Levitated Mass, 2012. It is a 340-ton granite megalith that sits over a 456-foot-long concrete slot. This sculpture is not so much about a particular rock that is a specific figure, but about its mass and about giving expression to a number, its sheer weight. It also plays out a classic artistic subject, the aesthetic experience we call the sublime, which is what we experience when confronted with forces and magnitudes beyond those of our own human scale. Not unlike shape, form can also be geometric or organic, and much like painting, there can be positive as well as negative space in sculpture. Robert Morris' Untitled, 1965, is a good example of geometric form. Negative and positive space also play out in this sculpture through the mirrored surface. Robert Morris was a post-minimalist artist, and this sculpture is unique in that it establishes a dialogue with minimalism. This is done by way of the mirrored surface, opening up the sculpture to its surroundings, letting the negative space around into the positive space of the sculpture. Minimalist and post-minimalist artists obsessed over the fundamental materiality and presentness of sculpture. They pretty much focused their efforts on how to bring these qualities to the fore, and both shunned away the modernist focus on internal composition. Sol LeWitt was an artist who, much like other minimalists, focused his efforts on primary structures. 5 Open Geometric Structures, 1979, would be a good example of both geometric form as well as negative and positive space. Here's a good example of organic form, Robert Morris's Template, 1967. With its vulcanized rubber, this sculpture never hangs the same way. It never takes the same form. And here is another good example of organic form, Linda Benglis' Quartered Meteor, 1969. We can almost see the molten lead, still hot, pouring in. Remember Henry Moore's large outdoor sculptures? And what about the figure-ground relationship, which changes as you go around them, not unlike Giambologna's Abduction of a Sabine Woman? Or how landscape pours through the inner negative forms. Since you cannot take it all in on one go, there is also an element of time at play in these artworks. Same thing happens in this piece of land art by Nancy Holt. It is also an example of positive and negative space, of how dynamic the relationship between figure and ground can be. The sculpture absorbs the surroundings too. It changes as the day changes and as the seasons goes by. You will either see the sun at a distance, through the tunnels, at dawn or dusk, or the sunlight pouring through the holes, casting constellations in the walls inside. Another good example of negative space here in Descent into Limbo 1992, by Anish Kapoor. In fact, there is nothing else other than negative space in this sculpture. A hole in the ground, all painted black. So black, in fact, that we can't see the bottom. The artist used a special paint called Vantablack, which blocks most of ultraviolet, visible, and infrared light. Remember how dangerous sculpture can be? A visitor once fell into this bottomless pit. Well, not really bottomless, but deep enough to get them a twisted foot. Much like shape, the principles of art, which are balance, rhythm, emphasis, movement, proportion, unity, and variety, apply equally to form. Richard Serra's shovel plate prop, 1969, transmits an impending sense of imbalance. There is no glue, no welding, only precarious balance is keeping in place this incredibly simple but effective sculpture. Scala Napolitana, 1985, by Joseph Beuys, also gives expression to balance or imbalance, depending on your point of view. It also plays out contrasting concepts of upward movement and gravity, set in place by way of various meanings, implied or otherwise unambiguous. The objects in display, a wooden ladder, a steel wire, and two balloon-like objects made of lead, they all work towards a significant whole. Much of minimalist sculpture relies on symmetry and repetition. Post-minimalism, however, introduces open form, asymmetry, and variety. Eva Hesse's Repetition 19:1, 1967, uses serial composition but adds variety along with organic form. Post-minimalist art is a reaction to minimalism's geometric hard edges. Joseph Beuys' Fat Chair, 1964 to 1985, is a good example of this. It is not unlike Linda Benglis' Quartered Meteor, but goes a step further. The molten lead of Quartered Meteor, which takes on a stationary state, gives way to full instability of form in this artwork. Hans Haacke's Blue Sail, 1964 to 1965, is yet another good instance of open form. The unsettled state of a piece of fabric that changes form as wind blows through and around it is the culmination of the anti-form stance of post-minimalism. An interesting fact about form is that sculpture gives place to installation art when unity is utterly lacking, as when the objects comprising a sole artwork are scattered in an exhibition space. Robert Morris' untitled Scatterpiece, 1968 to 1969, is a good example of installation art. Looking at this picture, we could wonder, is each one of these pieces of felt and metal a different sculpture? Or maybe just those that aggregate or gravitate around bigger pieces can be said to be separate artworks? Or is it all one big, messy piece of art? A title, a clear statement of intention, untitled Scatterpiece, settles the issue. It is one single piece of art, however spread out its various constituent elements may be. Thomas Hirschhorn's In Between, 2015, is also a good example of how lack of unity can give way to installation art. In 1967, art historian and critic Michael Fried became famous for his stance made public in a book titled Art and Objecthood, regarding how minimalist or literalist art engaged time. The historian and art critic correlated time with theatricality, as the emerging installation art genre came to demonstrate. Michael Fried drew inspiration from art critic Clement Greenberg, who suggested that painting and photography are there all at once and perceived in one grasp in their instantaneous unity, transcending the temporal perception of experience. Minimalist art, and later installation art, on the contrary, did not allow for that. In fact, according to Fried, it defeated any attempt by the beholder to take it all in on one go.